Martin Grant here, Cancel Me podcast number 1. This is my first podcast number 1. And I decided for my first podcast, I would get the most amazing guest anyone's ever had on a podcast of any kind. I don't want to build him up too much, but it's Randall Carlson. And Randall Carlson knows a lot about a lot. He's what we would call a polymath. And to give you an idea of what that means, because I didn't know what the hell it meant until about 6 months ago, a polymath is somebody who just loves to learn, enjoys learning, has a curiosity about everything, and the memory to back it up. So I think that is a pretty good intro to Randall Carlson, who Joe Rogan said was the most interesting guest he'd ever had on. And he's been on Joe Rogan's program now. There are 7 podcasts of Joe Rogan's with Randall Carlson that you can watch, and an 8th that hasn't even been dropped yet. So I'm very, very happy to have him on my show. And by the way, for full disclosure, we're also friends. He's a really, really awesome guy. So with no further ado, Randall Carlson.
Hello, Martin.
Hey, buddy. How are you?
I'm doing very well.
So your office looks fantastic. I was happy to be one of the first people to actually be in that office after you finished it.
You were, weren't you?
Yeah, that's right. And you still have that gorgeous table behind you back there? God, that thing, you can't see it from this angle really, but the inlays on that table and just, I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. And where did that table come from? Tell me again.
Where did it come? Well,
yeah, didn't you design that table yourself?
Well, yeah, we designed it. I designed it and my team built it.
Wow. Nice.
Yeah.
So
an awesome team of just top-notch craftsmen that work for us. And yeah, we're exploring the idea of producing a series of conference tables using the principles of sacred geometry, which
man, that's cool.
Table, what we did is that's the Cosmographia logo, which you see on our card here. So that's inlaid.
And that's your podcast.
This is my podcast, the Cosmographia.
And that's on YouTube.
Yeah, it's shown on YouTube, but really, HowTube is what we want to be. We want to send people over to HowTube.
Well, I like HowTube.
You have some connection to HowTube, don't you?
Yes, you can say I have a connection. Mike and I are the co-founders of HowTube. I was a very wealthy man when we decided to take on that project, and on paper, I'm still very wealthy because I own quite a bit of HowTube stock, and HowTube's interesting. As a matter of fact, believe it or not, I've actually made a little bit of money on HowTube, not on the stock, but actually by using HowTube. For what it was designed for. But you, if I'm not mistaken, you paid for that entire studio you're sitting in with HowTube money, right?
For a lot of it. A lot of it was HowTube money, and a lot of it was from personal appearances, lectures, conference presentations that I did. But the thing is, though, HowTube played a huge role in promoting those events. So yeah.
Awesome.
Has been, HowTube's been great. And I've really enjoyed getting to know Mike Robertson, who I basically met through you.
Yeah, Mike's a good guy. He really is.
Yeah. And I've gotten a little bit of the background stories on you guys. Good thing I didn't know any of that before I agreed to come on board, but
Unfortunately, it's all true.
That's what,
or at least 90% of it.
Yeah. Well, when I started hearing all of that, your exciting adventures back in the day, I thought, okay, now here's a couple of guys after my own heart.
It's amazing how similar our stories are going back. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, Randall is a grizzly bear. He's not actually a Homo sapien. The guy is huge. Like literally, when I'm in the room with him, well, if we can fit in the room together, whatever room it is, he's a big man. So, when you look at him, it's like, yep, Bigfoot exists.
Yeah, when you see me on podcasts, you think, what a dainty fellow.
Yeah.
I'm not that. Listen, You're the big guy. When you're in the room with me, I look you know, pretty medium. I
Well,
don't.
we are normal size guys. It's nice to be normal size.
Yeah, you know, I was when I was growing up. My goal was my first major failure in life. But I've learned to live with it because my goal was to be 6'3", and I only made it to 6'2", and then I think I've shrunk about 3/4 of an inch. So
Gravity. It's a
gravity,
bitch.
yeah, you know, you don't go along for 7 decades without gravity starting to have its effects.
Wait a minute. You're older than I am? No. Stop it.
Well, I think so. Yeah,
At least a couple of weeks.
I'm at least a couple of weeks older than you. Yeah, I'm older than you think.
And so, hey, I got a question for you, Randall. Were the pyramids built by a bunch of guys wearing loincloths that built a huge ramp and then just drug stones up there and just kind of tossed them willy-nilly, and they accidentally encoded a little bit of sacred geometry in this big ass triangle thing they were trying to make? Is that what I'm hearing from Egyptologists for the last pretty much 100 years?
Not to mention, along with the loincloths, that they would have been wearing Birkenstocks as well. So,
Of course, absolutely. You know, it's funny because I suspected that the pyramids were interesting because of fingerprints of the gods, but
mhm.
I thought I really kind of got it until I started talking to you about it. And some of the numbers that you've shown me are stunning. I mean, really sort of next level, what the hell? That's impossible. That kind of thing. Let's talk about those.
Well, we could do that. I was kind of prepared to talk about. I thought you kind of wanted to. Well, of course, you can't talk about one without the other. But
Okay.
I thought we were going to kind of dive into some catastrophism. But if you
Oh,
want,
let's do that. You know, I love a good catastrophe. Hell yes.
yeah,
There's
these,
nothing like a catastrophe to kick your week off.
especially if you're talking about a global scale catastrophe.
And by the way, that's something that you and I are going to have to definitely talk about, other than here on the podcast, because I've been doing a little homework here. Obviously, the Lake Missoula flood is something that you are eminently familiar with, more so than just about anybody else in the world that I'm aware of. So I decided, being the guy who always sort of the contrarian, I'd go to the other side of the earth and I'd study the Altai flood event, which strangely enough happened at exactly the same time. Now, I know that people say that it was an ice dam that broke with the Missoula flood, but how did it break the ice dam all the way on the other side of the earth at the same time? Because those two floods are commonly referred to as the largest floods in the history of mankind.
That
And
we
we
know.
go back 300,000 years.
Yeah, that we know about.
Right.
And certainly we know about a lot, and we have a pretty good record of large scale fluvial events going back hundreds of thousands of years. And those floods are on such a phenomenal scale that it's almost impossible to grasp the magnitude. And that's why we'll be doing a tour, our next tour of the great floodlands of the Pacific Northwest in May. And it takes some doing to get it. I mean, I can talk about it. I'll show slides. I'll show video clips. And what I hear over and over again is the idea that no matter how much preparation we've had, we're still not ready to understand or to comprehend the scale of these events. So that's why we take people out in the field for say a week. You spend a week, you maybe cover 1,500 miles. All right, touring around, looking at these sites, realizing then that all of these miles that you've logged up, hundreds and hundreds of miles, let's say from Montana to Washington State, you're looking at the same event. You're looking at an event that literally has left its footprints on 4 states, not even counting Canada. But as you said, the Altai flood is going on at the same time. but there are floods all over North America going on at the same time. It's just that the Pacific Northwest floods were the most spectacular. And so what I do is I bring people there because the landscapes are so mind-blowing. And once you begin to understand and you learn to read the script of catastrophism that has been preserved in the landscape, literally etched, engraved into the global landscape, then you're going to begin to see what has been lying hidden right in front of our faces in plain sight for 11, 12,000 years. And now, in the 21st century, we are in a unique position because for the first time, the human species can now begin to grasp the scale of this phenomena on a global scale and begin to appreciate how powerfully catastrophic these events were. And then when you factor in that our species, modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, has been walking this earth for probably at least 200,000 years. And then you look at the Pleistocene, which is the era of oscillating glacial, interglacial ages, which I'm going to pull up a slide here in a minute to help people get this impression. 2.5 million years. Within that 2.5 million years, there appears to be no other events on the scale of these Younger Dryas series of closely compressed catastrophes, which included now massive biomass burning on a global scale, a mass extinction of half the great megafaunal species of Earth, gigantic floods that can only be measured in hundreds of millions of cubic feet per second, gigantic spikes of climate change from warming to cooling to back again. And the interesting part to me about this is how did our ancestors survive all this? Woolly mammoths didn't survive. Saber-toothed cats didn't survive. The giant camels didn't survive. The giant beavers and armadillos, the cave bear, the giant short-faced bear, the Irish elk, the giant sloth, the dire wolves, go down the list, 100 to 120 species of megamammals, roughly equivalent to the number of megamammals, megafauna on Earth today, didn't survive. But we did survive. Otherwise, and I would be having this conversation, Martin.
How do you feel about the concept that we ate them?
We ate them. Well,
I mean, we obviously ate all of them. That's what the archaeologists have told us, is that they all disappeared because we ate them.
Yeah, well, the paleontologists are the ones.
Oh, paleontologists, excuse me, right.
Looking at the extinction. And, maybe a half a century ago, they couldn't come up with anything better because we were still strictly within the straitjacket of uniformitarian thinking a half a century ago. So what was conceived to be the most catastrophic thing that happened to the planetary environment? Well, the rise of humans, the rise of Homo sapiens sapiens with our atlatls and our, our ability to hunt these animals to extinction. But, I just recently was looking at a website. I have the link here on another page, so I'm not going to actually go to the link now. But I was looking at the estimates for world population during the late glacial maximum, which would have been, say, 18 to 25,000 years ago.
Okay.
The estimate range between 5 and 10 million people worldwide.
Okay. That's what I would have thought.
Now, other estimates as to the number of mammoths in the world during that period, 10 to 12 million. What that means is it's very possible that the number of mammoths outnumbered the number of humans. Now, when you take the number of humans, let's be generous and say, okay, let's go to the air on the high end. 10 million people. That's people. Now, that includes men, women, children, and elderly. How many of that 10 million are actually hunters? 20%, maybe.
Yeah, probably less.
Probably less, but let's be generous. Let's say there's a couple of million hunters. So you're going to tell me that a couple of million hunters using spears could exterminate 12 million mammoths plus another 100 species of mega mammal in 1,000 years? Doesn't make sense. It makes
Well,
zero sense.
now I did see a documentary called the Flintstones, and in it, Fred eats brontosaurus burgers that are absolutely enormous. You'd have to see them to believe how big they are, like the size of a car. So if everybody ate burgers that big, and it weren't just Fred Flintstone, then I could see that. But
Well,
short of that, no, I can't imagine how you would kill that many animals. That, by the way, the odds of killing one of them without it killing one of you in exchange. And then here's the thing that nobody talks about that I think you'll find really interesting: bunny rabbits and turkeys and dove and quail. That's what I'd hunt. I mean, if I were, if I were a caveman and I were looking to not get crushed under the foot of an elephant, especially something the size of a mammoth, I would probably just hunt smaller animals, which there were lots of.
yeah, and it's well known that Paleo-Indian peoples, Paleo-Indian hunters were hunting small game. It made up a large part of their diet. They were hunter-gatherers, which means they also gathered a lot of food that they ate. Fish made up a big part of their diet. Small game made up a big part of their diet. Large game made up a part of their diet, but certainly didn't dominate it. I mean, if you're going to picture, 10 million people eating 12 million mammoths in 1,000 years, you try to imagine in your head, how is this even possible? Because we're talking about the Western Hemisphere. We talk North America. How many people even stop to think that North America once hosted 4 species of elephants?
That's insane.
It's insane. Yeah, I mean, more elephants in North America than there were in Africa. There are now, I think there's 5 million elephants in Africa now. At the beginning of the 80s, there was about 10 million, and at the beginning of the 20th century, there was about 20 million.
Wow.
And those numbers have been lost to
That hurts.
droughts, poaching, hunting. But I think it's pretty much stabilized. In fact, it may have gone up since the numbers I looked at. It may have gone up from 5 million. Interesting thing, though, about in the 80s, there were some horrible droughts in sub-Saharan Africa, and there was a huge wave of elephant mortality. And so there were elephant carcasses that accumulated around drying up water holes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So paleontologists that specialize in taphonomy. Now, taphonomy is the study of what processes occur between the death of an individual animal and its final preservation as a fossil. What is that sequence of changes, in terms of physical changes, in terms of chemical changes, etc.? And of course, it's different. It depends on how the animal dies. It depends on the post mortality environment, right? So if it's preserved in water, that's one thing. If it's preserved in permafrost, or if it's just in the case of the African elephants that died at the watering hole, their carcasses are just laying out on the land surface. So what the paleontologists who were studying the taphonomic processes realized and found out was that you could have a whole elephant. Now we're talking about a 3 to 5 ton elephant. Dies, its carcass lays on the landscape. Within 5 years, there's nothing left. It's been completely consumed by scavengers. It's been broken down, weathered away. Yet, when we go back and start looking at Pleistocene animals, particularly the mammoths, no, there remains, and this is how we've been able to estimate the numbers of woolly mammoths. Their remains are found in tremendous abundance, particularly in the high northern latitudes where they've been preserved in permafrost. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of remains have been recovered from the permafrost, from banks of rivers that, we were in the 800 years, 700 years of the Little Ice Age. When that came to an end, mid-19th century, one of the things that happened is it warmed up in Alaska and Siberia, and a lot of the permafrost, particularly along river channels, was now exposed to the warming, the post Little Ice Age warming. What that caused was, more rain, swollen streams, and then the melting permafrost began to collapse. And then as it did so, all kinds of remains of interred megafauna was revealed, including the famous Beresovka mammoth that was found in 1901, that had been frozen in the permafrost for many millennia, with the delicate tissues, marbled flesh still preserved, the hair preserved, contents of the stomach preserved. And this was the thing that really fueled some of the early catastrophist thinking in the 60s, when some people who looked at it said, you can't explain this without a catastrophic climatic change.
Right.
Because you don't get a 5-ton mammoth, frozen through and through. I mean, Clarence Birdseye, the inventor of the fast freezing method for food, you probably heard of Birdseye food.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's named after Clarence Birdseye, and he was the foremost expert on the effects of flash freezing on flesh. He came in, took a look at it, did some calculations, said, well, how long would it... so we've got contents of the stomach that haven't putrefied. So that means that in order to prevent putrefaction of the stomach contents had to be frozen within 10 hours. Now, the other thing that was interesting about this mammoth is that the mammoth had a mouthful of plants that he had been chewing on at his sudden demise. And there were, I think, 20-some varieties of plant life in between his mouth and his stomach. And Birdseye looked at that, said, okay, in order for the contents of the stomach to not putrefy, it has to be frozen within 10 hours. So then that raised the question of, well, what kind of temperature does it require to entirely freeze a 5 or 6 ton mammoth carcass in less than 10 hours? And that's where it gets interesting, because now you're talking about, 120 to 150, perhaps in that range below zero. And of course, since the mammoth had been sitting there chewing plants in his mouth at the time of his sudden demise, we know that the climate was probably, and based upon the type of pollen and the stage of flowering and everything, that it was probably autumn. A cool autumn day, the mammoth is there munching away contentedly, and then literally a few minutes later, he's dead and buried and then frozen in the permafrost. So it raised some interesting questions as to what processes are involved in this.
Nothing that I've ever heard of, short of, God forgive me, The Day After Tomorrow, the movie where there are instant freezes because of climatic change, blah, 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 and we go into an ice age.
Well, instant freezes, yes. Day After Tomorrow, though, the instant freezes are completely fictional, because carbon dioxide is not going to do that under any circumstances.
Right, exactly.
Agency. And I think the agency has left its fingerprints over large swaths of the Earth's surface. And I think that clearly, I think this is the scenario that's going to be eventually verified within the next few years. And that is that this planet suffered a period of clustered bombardment. And on top of that period of clustered bombardment, there was probably also a hyperactive sun that would have been actually connected with the ultimate genesis of this clustered bombardment. Clustered bombardment would have most likely been the result of a gigantic comet making its way to the inner solar system, probably between 25 and 30,000 years ago, which then triggered what is known as the Late Wisconsin rapid glacial expansion, after the glaciers almost disappeared.
Right.
Between 30 and 40,000 years ago, right? They came roaring back around 26,000 years ago. Okay. So I would speculate that this is the most likely time that this comet then entered the inner solar system. It then began to undergo a hierarchy of disintegration events, which littered the inner solar system with the debris, the byproducts of its fragmentation. And then on a periodic basis, Earth would run through streams of this debris with multiple encounters ensuing. And this may have happened as many as 3, almost certainly 2 times at the beginning and the end of the Younger Dryas, and maybe even a little earlier, because it looks like the dating of the first mega flood was about 14,500 years ago. And there was a huge spike of global freezing and followed by global warming at about 14.5. So it would make sense that this was a period of rapidly accelerated melting. And then we have the lower Younger Dryas boundary at about 12,850 to 12,900 years ago. And we know that there was another massive spike of climatic change, threw us back into, after 3,000 or 4,000 years of gentle warming, as the planet is coming out of the late glacial maximum, starting around 15 to 17,000 years ago. That gentle warming that had accumulated over this period of time suddenly was reversed. And over the next roughly 1,300 years of the Younger Dryas, the planet plunged back into full glacial cold. Glaciers began to expand, and it was in that interval that most of the megafauna disappeared. And then at about 11,600 years ago, there was another climate catastrophe, followed by what has been referred to as meltwater pulse 1b, which was an injection of huge volumes of glacial meltwater into the global oceans, causing rapid sea level rise. And that was, interestingly and coincidentally, the precise date that is now given for the transition out of Pleistocene epoch into the Holocene epoch. And coincidentally, it's precisely the date that Plato gives in his 2 dialogues about Atlantis, because the story that Plato delivers in the Atlantis dialogues is the story handed down from Solon, the the Greek lawgiver and poet and philosopher, who did a 10-year sojourn in Egypt and heard the tale of Atlantis from the old elderly priests, who, according to them, had preserved that story in their sacred records for 9,000 years prior to Solon's exile into Egypt. So, given that Solon's historically dated sojourn in Egypt occurred at about 600 BC, do the math. Add your 9,000 to 600 BC, and you've got now the cataclysm, the seismic events that caused the subsidence of Atlantis into the Atlantic Ocean, according to Plato's account, would have occurred 11,600 years ago, which is precisely meltwater pulse 1b.
It's
and
interesting.
The date of the ending of the Younger Dryas.
It's very interesting that for all of those years, people looked at Aristotle and Socrates and Plato and said they are the founders of modern philosophy, of modern thought, of the love of truth. Except when they say something that doesn't fit our narrative, then they're just a bunch of bumbling old fools.
Pretty much, yeah.
Really interesting.
The standard scholarly response is that Plato merely intended the story of Atlantis as a metaphor for his ideal political and economic situation, and no more than that. And he may have borrowed on some elements that pre-existing mythological elements to frame his conception of the idealized state, but he did not mean it literally. However, when you read the dialogues, what you find out is that he repeatedly says he means it literally.
Right.
So you have to discount that fact that Plato himself affirms multiple times that this is a real story This is not metaphorical. I didn't make this up. This is real. Veritable is the word the translators use because he's saying it's a true story. So, and then, I have done a long, 9 hours. I've taken the Plato dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, and I have dissected them. I've gone through his detailed account, and I've looked at the geology, the geography, the oceanography, the astronomy, the details that he gives, and then I contrast that with what we now know from the realm of scientific research. And what I have demonstrated in that 9 hours of podcasts that I did about a year ago, what I've shown in there is that there's nothing implausible about Plato's account at all. He doesn't describe, first of all, let's get clear, he doesn't describe, crystal powered spaceships and lasers and all of this.
Right.
His version of an advanced civilization is an advanced maritime culture, maybe along the lines you would picture the Phoenicians or the Minoans times 10, but with the implication that they would have had navigational skills, which obviously then implies they had astronomical knowledge.
Right.
And he describes that they had an empire that went well beyond their island home in the mid-Atlantic. And so is this so implausible that during the late Ice Age, as it turns out, the mid-Atlantic, there is a group of islands there that are the peaks of mountains. There's overwhelming evidence of a major subsidence event along the mid-Atlantic ridge at the end of the last Ice Age. Okay.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's there. Martin, you got to get down and you got to listen to that 9-hour lecture.
Sounds like it, because that is, that's a kind of a huge missing part, because I know the Azores are sort of an anomaly. Like, nobody really knows what the hell happened on the Azores or how long ago it was. But something was going on there a long time ago. A long time ago.
The Azores Island are the peaks of mountains that are situated on what is known as the Azores Plateau. The Azores Plateau is a unique geological or geographical phenomena called a microcontinent. So a microcontinent is one that never got big enough to be an actual continent, but it's really almost like bigger than an island. But the Azores Plateau, to give you a sense of the scale, the Azores Plateau is roughly the size of Iceland. And it's 2,000 feet, 2,500 feet under the water. It flanks the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, just like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge cuts through Iceland, and that's why there's so much volcanism there. Right. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge cuts through the Azores Plateau. So you got some of the Azores Islands to the west of the ridge, some of it to the east of the ridge, right? However, if you go back during the Ice Age, one of the things that has been well documented now is the Mid-Atlantic, the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream, and this is one of the reasons why northwestern Europe got so damn cold during the Ice Age, because the Gulf Stream did a hairpin turn, probably somewhere around 1,000 miles further south than it now. It goes all the way up to almost to Scandinavia. Before it reverses and starts heading back south again. And by that time, the waters have cooled because they're coming up from the equator. They're bringing all that warmth up. They're disgorging that warmth. The water's cool. The cold water sinks because it's denser. It sinks to the bottom, and then it creates literally a cold, gigantic underwater river that now begins heading south again. Well, during the Ice Age, the Gulf Stream was not nearly one of the things that it does now is because of the higher sea level, it diverts into the Gulf of Mexico. Okay. So that gives it additional time to pick up extra heat that it now carries up to northwestern Europe, right? That's why the British Isles is so much warmer than eastern Canada and the maritime provinces, even though they're at the same latitude, right? But during the Ice Age, the Gulf Stream wrapped around the Azores. So what that means is that if you were looking on planet Earth for optimal real estate to establish a civilization, Azores would have been an ideal place.
Completely surrounded by warm water.
That's right. That's right. So you would have had a climate almost like perpetual spring, while the rest of the planet is in the depths of the ice age. So it would have been the ideal place for a civilization to evolve. And again, when you get into Plato's details, there's nothing so fringe about it. There's nothing so exotic about it that it couldn't possibly have elements of truth to it. Now, we know that a lot of different researchers have postulated all these different places for the location of Atlantis. You know, the latest is the recap structure by Jimmy, but he's in a long line of, it goes back to the island of Santorini in the Eastern Mediterranean. It goes to Turkey. It goes to Doggerland. It goes to Cuba. It goes to Bimini, Southeastern United States, South America, Antarctica. But there's only one place that conforms precisely to Plato's details, and that's the region of the Azores. And we haven't even talked about what that evidence is for massive subsidence along the mid-Atlantic ridge, but it exists. And I go into great detail. I break it down on my Atlantis presentation. I show all the graphics, the research studies. I give the references and everything. It's a hell of an interesting study. If anybody is interested in Atlantis, my goal with this thing was to try to give not the final word on the subject of Atlantis, but to get us closer than we've ever been to the final word on Atlantis. So makes for, and I tried to make it affordable. You can download it, watch it at your leisure. But it's jam-packed with really interesting information.
Now, here's the thing. Let's take a step back here, because the view of the soldier in the trench is very different than the general using GPS, satellite photography, and coordinates. So let's take a step back from the A word, Atlantis, which recently has become a lot more interesting because people don't just start laughing when you say it. You don't have to you don't have to smoke a pound of weed a day and eat mushrooms for breakfast, psilocybin mushrooms for breakfast, in order to believe in Atlantis. And 30 years ago, if you said Atlantis out loud, that automatically made you a hippie. I mean, it's like, hey, let's go to the Grateful Dead concert because clearly you believe in Atlantis. Well, let me throw in a little sort of help with the focus. And I know you'll laugh when you hear this because you know who this is. There was this guy named Heinrich Schliemann. Everybody thought that he was a really solid businessman, sharp cat back in the 1800s. And he was a German industrialist, and he was very successful, a self-made man. And people said to him, you're a really good businessman. And he said, yeah, but I want to be an archaeologist. And they said, well, you're rich. You can do whatever you like. And he said, I'm going to go find the city of Troy. And they said, oh, wait, full stop. Troy's a myth. There is no city of Troy. That was just hyperbole. That was a metaphor for something that was real. Clearly, there's no city of Troy. It's like there's not a place called Troy. That whole thing is just, that was made up. And he said, no, I don't think so. I think I'm going to use the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I'm going to go and I'm going to find this place. And they said, look, you're a businessman. Stick with business because you clearly don't know what you're talking about. But he was crazy enough and wealthy enough that he decided to go find Troy. And Randall, how'd he do?
The last I heard, he was eminently successful.
Yep, he found Troy. Yep. And not only did he find Troy, but he found Troy in a way that was almost comical because he leaned against a cliff so that a photographer, because this was end of the 1800s and photography was starting to really kick off, a photographer had come from a newspaper. They were going to write a newspaper article about his sort of daft, idiotic search for this mythical place that didn't exist. And he put his hand against the side of this hill, and the loose dirt fell away, and a piece of jewelry fell out of the hole that was left behind. And he picked it up and said, "Hey, this is jewelry." Sure enough, it was the beginning of the excavation of Troy.
Mm-hmm.
And so from there, they dug everything else out. And what did he do? He just looked at the Iliad, and he said, "Okay, well, based on what this book says by this guy, who we can clearly take very literally at his word, I'm going to go find Troy." And yet people say, well, that was then. This is now. Same guy, though, isn't it? If I'm not mistaken, aren't we talking about the same philosopher who wrote that both of those? I mean, I think it was Plato, right?
Yeah.
And so Troy turned out to be real, even though everybody thought that he was using it as a metaphor, because clearly an entire civilization like the Trojans couldn't have existed unless the professionals knew about it.
Yeah. No, wait. You didn't say that the Iliad and the Odyssey were not written by Plato. That's not what you said, right?
Oh, Plato, Homer. I'm sorry. Right. Hello. So, but my point is that they thought Homer was exaggerating to make a point, just like they think that Plato is exaggerating to make a point. There are a lot of people who, when it suits them, they take these philosophers very seriously. And when it doesn't, they just say, well, he didn't mean it. That sounds like a problem this society has right now, which is lack of accountability for what you say and do, but not Greek philosophers. They didn't get their chops that way.
Right. They weren't looking for likes on TikTok.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly right. So we've got this guy named Plato who says that this place existed, and we've got lots of evidence that there was a place exactly. And by the way, the thing about all of the other places, the pillars of Hercules, etc. The one thing that I really thought was odd was, the use, because it never, I don't know why, but it just didn't occur to me that the Atlas Mountains in North Africa or the Atlantic Ocean, isn't there an Indian group in South America, the Atoll Indians, I believe, and it's odd because there are also some very, very European-looking people called the Chechapoya, the Cloud people, in the northern part of South America, and it all adds up to, we're not really sure what the hell's going on here, but there's more to the human story than meets the eye. And like Graham says, there's a missing chapter. And what's interesting is that, there are people like you out there who are actually trying to write that chapter. Now, the question I've got for you is, why would anyone not want you to write that chapter? Because that's a question that bothers me about a lot of things, not just Atlantis, not just about your hypothesis about the comet hitting the Laurentide ice sheet, because clearly we can see the evidence of that. And yet for years it wasn't accepted. It was just, and I guess the good news is for you weren't attacked in the same way that somebody like Graham Hancock was. But as you said to me 10 years ago, I was mostly ignored. Well, I mean, I guess that's better than being attacked. But at the same time, you didn't start to really pick up major credibility with this until what, 3 decades after you started thinking and talking about it?
Something about that. I mean, yeah. I mean, I first formulated the idea of multiple impacts into the ice sheet certainly by the early 90s. Really, actually, by the late 80s, I was thinking that. And there's a long story, kind of how I circled around a number of different ideas, including the idea of pole shift along the lines of Charles Hapgood, a crustal shift. I was definitely a committed catastrophist by the mid to late 80s. Absolutely no doubt.
By the way, for those people who don't know, explain that, because catastrophism is an interesting way of thinking as opposed to
uniformitarianism.
Okay, because I've heard it called gradualism as sort of a way of dumbing it down, but uniformitarianism, that is a mouthful.
It's a mouthful.
Well, what do these two mean? What do these two things mean, and why are they so at odds?
The interestingly, and I've written on this. You can find some of this stuff in my some of my writings that are posted on HowTube on my website, as a matter of fact, and there's more to come. Getting into the very interesting history of the founding of geology and the people who were involved in this, from William Buckland to Georges Cuvier to Adam Sedgwick to Roderick Murchison. If you go through the founding fathers of geology back in the early to, say, post-Civil War period of the 19th century, they were almost to a man all catastrophists. Mid-19th century, you had Charles Lyell. First you had James Hutton, who came along, and one of the things that happened was that with the idea of, some of the, like Sedgwick, for example, he was a theologian. So he's traveling over England, and he's seeing firsthand in the landscape the imprints of gigantic floods. He's now thinking that this was evidence of Noah's flood. And so in his mind, he was thinking that this was confirmation of the Noachian deluge, as described in the book of Genesis. Right? Now, whether it was or wasn't is almost a moot point. The point is that what he was looking at was, in fact, evidence of tremendous fluvial events, almost certainly related to the very rapid melting of the so-called Fennoscandian ice sheet that covered a lot of northwestern Europe. Okay, so him and others, they speculated about the evidence that they were seeing firsthand without the filter of some type of an academic dogma, because that hadn't been contrived yet.
Right.
Well, they're also still within the framework of a very young Earth. So as we see the 19th century evolve, by the time we get to the post-Civil War era and into the later decades of the 19th century, the span of time during which the Earth was conceived to have existed got much, much longer. So one of the attitudes, and this was kind of expressed by James Hutton, who was the sort of the founding father of gradualism, he said, well, with all of this extended extra time we've got now, we don't need catastrophes in the same sense that we did to accomplish the same amount of work, geomorphic work, in a very short period of time. We've got hundreds of thousands of years and then millions of years to accomplish this. You then had Charles Lyell, who was originally a lawyer, comes back, writes a whole, lawyer turned geologist. And what I
hate him already.
Yeah, he was the one who codified the idea. He took James Hutton's, and I believe it was William Playfair, who kind of conceived of these ideas of incremental change accumulating over many, many, many thousands of years. Charles Lyell took that, codified it into the theory that became known as uniformitarianism. Now, so Charles Lyell does this, and he sort of used his lawyerly skill to cast the framework of the argument and did a pretty impressive job of discrediting the catastrophists. One reason why this was important to do was because, and you can almost excuse these guys, because what's happening is we're getting away from the straitjacket of biblical literalism. So what we do is break science out of that mold of biblical literalism. And so they're saying, okay, well, if we accept the idea that there have been these catastrophes and giant floods, it's just taking us back to Noah's flood. It's taking us back to biblical literalism. We're getting past that we're now scientific. So that was a big part of the thinking, is we've got to, because bear in mind, 100 to 200 years earlier, look what's happening to people like Giordano Bruno and Galileo and stuff,
right,
who are proposing things that are outside that strict literal biblical framework, right? So they were like, we've got to get away from that. So you almost can't blame them. But here's what happened. They then established, now up to this time, there's not been geology as a scientific discipline. There has not been geology as an academic pursuit that you could go to a university and get a degree in. That didn't come along until the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. So once that happened, those who were establishing the academic institutions of teaching geology had to codify it into dogmas. So when they did that, they said, this is acceptable. We can have incremental change over long periods of time, and we don't need catastrophes. Simultaneously, side by side with that, here comes Darwinian evolution. It's basically saying the same thing.
Got it.
Changes, almost inobservable incremental changes over long periods of time. So now you have gradualist geology and you have Darwinian evolution, both predicated upon the idea of incrementalism. So they sort of reinforced each other. And that's why for the first 3/4 of the 20th century, if you came along and started proposing catastrophist type ideas, you were sent out to the hinterlands.
Right.
A couple of exceptions. Probably the most famous exception was J. Harlan Bretz, who, he was started out as a high school science teacher with a hobby of geology, eventually became a degree geologist, and then eventually got the Penrose Medal, which is the highest honor in geology. It's the Oscar of geology, right? Geological science. Although he didn't get it till he was, I think, like 96 years old. Now, what he did was he went out in the early 1920s and he began looking at these landscapes of eastern Washington. Now, what originally triggered him was the release in 1910 of the 1 to 24,000 quadrangle of the U.S. Geological Survey topographical maps of a particular feature in eastern Washington along the Columbia River called Potholes Cataract.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
He got a hold of that map and he looked at it and he goes, what the hell am I looking at? He went out there and that started this multiple decade odyssey that just took him out over, many, many miles of traversing in foot, by car, by horseback, with graduate students and stuff. Every season he's out there for the next, quarter century, right, documenting this evidence that there had been this gigantic flood or series of floods, which was completely rejected by the geological community. At the time, there's a famous story where James Galooly, who led the opposition, set up an ambush, invited J. Harlan Bretz to come to Washington, D.C., and this is after decades of controversy and his ideas being rejected. He's invited to D.C. and ostensibly to give his work and his ideas a fair hearing, but in reality, it was an ambush.
Right.
The idea was, we're going to do this. We're going to invite this guy here, and we're going to put the final nails in the coffin, put this catastrophic flood idea to rest. So he goes there in Washington, D.C. He was ambushed. The consensus opinion there amongst the distinguished geologists there was, there's other much more gradualistic explanations that can explain what you're looking at. However, sitting in the audience was a geologist by the name of J.T. Pardee, who worked for the U.S. Geological Survey. And he's been sitting there listening the whole time to what Bretz is presenting. Now, in 1910, the same year that Bretz looked at that topographical map, J.T. Pardee published a paper called Glacial Lake Missoula. It was his first published paper as a young professional geologist. So in this paper, he documents evidence that he found in western Montana for the existence of a giant glacial lake, right? Now, decades go by. We're up now into the 1940s. He's getting ready to retire. He's kind of kept his research on this gigantic glacial lake in western Montana on the down low because he knows it's going to be controversial.
Right.
He knows that if he starts talking about it, but because look, he's working for the U.S. Geological Survey, so he had his assigned things that he's supposed to be focusing on. However, he kept up his interest in this, what he called Glacial Lake Missoula, and then his final professional paper that he wrote before he retired was about Glacial Lake Missoula. Okay, now, so his career is bookended by these two articles, 1910, I think it was 1942, where he's talking about this gigantic lake. What has evolved in his thinking is expressed, exemplified in the title of that 1942 paper. The title of it was Unusual Currents in Glacial Lake Missoula. Got it? Unusual currents.
Of course. Very subtle.
A non-emotive way of expressing what he'd learned in the interim, because he discovered the existence of these gigantic current ripple fields, where you're talking about the kind of current ripples you would see on a sandbar next to a river or creek or on the beach, except these suckers are 20, 30, 40, 50 feet high, as much as a 4 or 5 story building in some cases, wavelengths of 150 up to 300 and 400, 500 feet. There's a famous field of these current ripples in a place called Camas Prairie, eastern Montana. I've taken many people there to see it for themselves, because that's one of those things where when you see it, you look at it and you go, oh, I think I'm beginning to get it now.
Yeah.
So anyways, he writes this paper called Unusual Currents, right? Now, this is James Galooly. He's sitting in the room there, in the meeting room in Washington, D.C. He had concluded that somewhere to the west, like, okay, how do you get this gigantic glacial lake? Well, he's looking at the maps and he realizes that there's an outlet to the northwest where now the Lake Pend Oreille in the northern panhandle of Idaho is occupied by this giant deep lake, Lake Pend Oreille. It's one of the deepest lakes in America. It's so deep that the U.S. Navy tests 3/4 scale submarines in that lake, right?
Right.
So there's the Clark Fork River that goes to the northwest. The valley of it opens out into what is now the basin occupied by Lake Pend Oreille. So Pardee, based upon a reference going back to one of the early 19th century godfathers of geology, T.C. Chamberlain, who also saw evidence in the form of shorelines in the same basins that Pardee was looking at, speculated that maybe somewhere to the west there was an ice dam. Pardee picks up on that and speculates also that there was an ice dam to the west. Now, so, and then what must have happened was the pressures of this huge lake got so great, it was able to burst through the ice dam, rapidly draining out, creating what Pardee referred to as the unusual currents. So at the conclusion of this hearing, this ambush in this room in Washington, D.C., Pardee leans over to one of his colleagues sitting next to him at the table and he whispers, I know where Bretz's water came from. So Pardee, listening to that, went away convinced. See, now here's what's happened. Pardee's decades of research in western Montana, Bretz's decades of research in eastern Washington are coming together right there. Now, there's another part to this story. James Galooly, who was the foremost critic attacking Bretz, who organized this ambush, had never been to the Scablands.
Oh, God.
Been to these figures. So he was shamed into finally getting out in the field. So there was a group, and this probably, I don't remember the exact year. Graham Hancock gives a great summary of this story in Magicians of the Gods. Okay. They go out in the field. They spend a week going around, and Galooly is seeing all of this evidence, trying to concoct up ways. Okay, how do we explain a 2-mile boulder bar?
Right.
How do we explain these backflood sediments up into tributary valleys? How do we explain the existence of what appear to be cataracts, but there's no water there?
Right.
He's trying to come up with individual ways to explain away this whole suite of evidence. At the end of the week, they go to a place called the Palouse River, to a place called Palouse Falls. Now, I've taken groups there repeatedly because it's one of those things where it's just like other things. When you see it, it's like the light bulb begins to go off.
You can't unsee it.
Oh my God, I'm beginning to understand now. Okay, so Galooly, the group comes there. There's this massive cataract with the little Palouse River flowing over. There's a 400-foot deep gash in the earth, 30 miles long, going down, that leads to the Palouse into the Snake River. It's very clear that the diminutive Palouse River did not create this cataract, did not cut this gouge into the basalt, the hard basalt. Now, this is connected with a suite of ripples, giant ripples, huge boulder bars.
Right.
So it said that Galooly, they've even now since the first times I ever went to Palouse Falls, they've actually posted a sign there now at the falls. When you come into the parking lot, you see this sign there, and it gives a very abbreviated version of the story I'm telling here. So the group gets there. Galooly walks over, and he's standing on the rim of this huge circular bowl-shaped cataract, looking at the tortured rock on either side of it, hundreds of feet above the modern river. He's looking at this deep channel. He stands for a long time peering at this, walks back, very quiet, very thoughtful. He gets back to the group and he looks at them and he goes, exact words, "How could I have been so wrong?"
Ooh, he stood there for that long because it takes that long to swallow your ego when you've got testosterone poisoning, which all men do.
Isn't this the way science is supposed to work?
It's exactly how it's supposed to work.
An extraordinary idea. You got to come up with extraordinary proof.
Exactly.
Look, if this idea has merit, it can withstand the assaults.
That's exactly right.
He did what he needed to do. He gave it his best shot to try to come up with an alternative to the fact that there were these gigantic diluvial events. And in the end, he finally realized it was real, and he came on board.
Man, you know what? You got to respect that. You got to respect that. That's science.
That's science. That's how it's
in action.
That's exactly.
By the way, Randall, I got to tell you, this is one of the downsides to not having a studio in my house yet. We're running out of time. They got other people coming in, so can we pick this up again? Can we do more of this?
You know what I'd like to do, and here's what I was thinking, Martin. Using maybe do a little series and introduce. I've been refining and improving and streamlining my presentations on catastrophism. And when I started my podcast 3 years ago, I spent a lot of time diving into, devoting episodes to it.
Right.
But I've been necessarily pulled away and talking about a lot of other things that have been coming up. And there's been a lot of new research that's come out in the last 3 years that I'm just now integrating into my scenario, into my storyline. How about this? Why don't we use, over the next couple of months, maybe figure 3 or 4 episodes, and we will introduce the cutting edge models of global catastrophism to the world through your podcast.
I love it. I love that idea. That is fantastic.
Let's do that.
Because I love this stuff. This is what I do for fun.
Yeah.
Geologists do what they do for money. I do this for fun. I love this stuff.
And this is why we need to drag your ass out into the field.
In May.
Are you going to do the May trip?
I'm going to have to now. I mean, come on.
You've got to, man. I can't.
You know, I will.
I will get as much pleasure out of watching your face.
It's true, because you've laid some information on me a couple times now in the last 10 years where I was speechless, and that's saying something, because I've always got something to say.
Believe me, I know that well. And to render Martin Grant speechless, that is really an accomplishment.
Exactly. And you know, that's the thing. And that, like, one of the things that we've got to talk about, the boulder and the iceberg. If I didn't have 2 minutes left, I would love to go over that, but that'll be one of the things we talk about next time.
Yeah, well, make sure that we get our screen sharing operation down and smooth and everything, and then I can pull in and we can actually look at some. I've got some great drone footage now I didn't have 3 years ago.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Because that puts it in perspective. That really does.
Yes, it does. So yeah, let's do it, man.
Man, I am so glad you joined me for this first podcast. This is awesome. What a great way to kick off a podcast with somebody like you who, you know, I mean, this is it. Cutting edge is the best there is.
Yeah, man. And you know, I always like hanging out with you, Martin.
I love it too, man. I love hanging out with you. So, and you know, I'm glad we didn't get too much into some of the sundry things we've done in the past, because, you know, I mean, beer and girls and trouble, and it's just, and you know, driving too fast. It's testosterone.
Yeah.
But now we're older and wiser.
We are definitely older.
I was just thinking that. All right, man.
Wiser. It's not that I'm wiser. I just can't do the things that I
I'm at that danger zone where I'm supposed to know better, but I can still get away with it. So I try once in a while.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that we both got stories.
Absolutely. Lots of them. Hey, man, next time we'll plan on, you know, we'll break this up into several segments, but I really appreciate you coming on today.
Oh, man. Thanks for the invite, and I look forward to seeing your face in person. But before that, we'll be doing another episode of what do you call your podcast, by the way?
Cancel Me.
Cancel Me. All right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another episode of Cancel Me.
You got it, buddy. Talk to you soon.
Adios, my pal.
Bye-bye.